Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we're going to talk about an absolute game-changing technique for early fall bass fishing. It is one of my favorite ones to throw when you have schooling fish, you have fish feeding on small bait fish. I learned this one down on Lake Hartwell fishing in the BFL All-American, actually from the owner of the company. He was fishing against me and he whooped my butt. He almost won the whole tournament on this bait right here, and when they are on it, they are on it. So stay tuned and let's get right into it. So what is this technique here that's going to catch you a bunch of fish throughout the fall? This is called a pulse fish. I actually fish it on a spinning rod here, so you don't need heavy equipment at all. You actually can't use heavy equipment for this. You can't even really throw this thing on a bait caster because this guy right here only weighs 1/8 of an ounce. And it's tiny. Now we are going to talk about some versatility here throughout the video. We're also going to talk about the rod and reel setup, but what does this bait essentially do throughout the fall and what makes it so special? So what this is the pulse fish is a little jig head, and it has a little polycarbonate or plastic something lip that is upturned on the bait. It's very similar to a scrounger head. There are scrounger heads that you could use as well, I'm sure, if you could find one in the right size. This guy right here is a 1/8 ounce jig head, and it has a 2/0 hook. And then I also have one in a 1/4 ounce if I need to get the bait a little bit deeper. That one has a 3/0 hook in it. One of the keys is going to be that small hook, so that's very important if you're looking for other ones that are out there on the market. But ultimately you need a very light jig head, and what this plastic lip is going to do is going to make this bait vibrate and do all kinds of erratic action while you're reeling it in. That's also where this trailer comes in. There are a couple options that I really like on the trailer here, this one being the Zoom Tiny Fluke. There is the Zoom, it's called the Fluke. It doesn't have the slit in the belly, it doesn't have the profile that the regular Zoom Super Flukes have, but even the Fluke version that's a little bit bigger than this is too big for this technique. So you do need the tiny Fluke, and like I said, if you have fish that feed on very small bait fish, oftentimes in the early fall what'll happen is this shad will spawn in like May, June. Those shad will grow up a little bit, but they'll only get like this big, and at the very end of the year when those fish are looking to feed up for fall, it's a lot easier for them to just go and get mouthfuls of these very small shad than it is to get a giant shad and wait for them to come around or try and track that down and actually get it in their belly, something like that. They're looking to just put on as much weight as they can. So if they have an all-you-can-eat buffet of these tiny little shad, they're just going to keep eating and eating and eating and eating until they can get healthy enough to live through the winter. That's where this little tiny bait fish comes in. It is one of the only techniques I've ever seen that can actually imitate some of those really small bait fish, and when those fish are keyed in on that, sometimes it's hard to get them to eat other things. Poppers will work and other small techniques, but this is one that I've really seen work exceptionally well. That's why this trailer is awesome. If you have some bigger bait fish, sometimes the shad can get a little bit bigger. You have some bigger fish, you want a bigger hook, something like that, or you need it to get deeper. That's when I'll go to the 1/4 ounce, and I'll actually use a Zoom Super Fluke Junior. You could also just use the Zoom Fluke that I talked about, that's just a little bit bigger version of this guy here, or the Zoom Super Fluke Junior will work as well. Ultimately, you just want a very small shad imitating bait that you're going to thread on here. Hook will be exposed. I super glue it to the head so that it doesn't come off, and then you're good to go. That is the bait setup right there. It's super simple, and it'll allow you to catch a bunch of fish all fall long. So as I've talked about a little bit, this allows you to catch fish that are feeding on small bait fish. The types of areas I'm going to look for when I'm fishing this bait are going to be those steep points that those fish can push bait up on top of. So what will usually happen is there'll be a very flat point that goes way out in the lake, and then it'll drop off very quickly. So the ones that I was fishing recently, I was on West Branch Lake in Ohio. It would be like 6 foot on top, it would drop off into like 30 foot down on the bottom, and you could bring this bait across the flat spot up on top and off the drop, and those fish would wait on the sides. When they saw bait fish, they'd push them up on top of the shelf and they'd start schooling, and you could catch a bunch of them in a row bringing this bait through that school of fish. They'd be keyed on very small bait like this. You could see the bait jumping and they were this big, so I knew that the fish were feeding on small bait fish. Excellent way to catch them. Look for very steep drops, anywhere those fish can just push bait upward. I was catching them on Hartwell, fishing over like 40 foot of water. They would hide in brush piles down low. The water was super clear. As those shad would come across the top, they would push them up to the surface, and you'd be able to catch them that way. So this bait doesn't need to get down to the bottom. It never will get down to the bottom. It literally only rides maybe a foot below the surface. It sometimes is a very specific technique, but if they're keyed in on small bait fish, that's a great way to do it. Now, when you're fishing this bait, I fish it very simply. You just cast it out there, you'll let it sink down however far you want it, and you just start a slow retrieve with your spinning reel, and you'll feel it vibrate just like a chatterbait in the rod tip. As long as that's happening, you're good. This little tail is going to kick the whole way back. It's going to look like one of those little shad trying to run away that might have got escaped from the school of other shad, and then they can key in and target that one. It'll look slightly different than the other shad too, so sometimes that can get you some more bites. The other thing you could do is incorporate a couple twitches in your rod tip if you really feel the need to, or you can stop and start your retrieve as well. But for the most part, these fish are aggressively feeding and they're looking for something trying to run away from them, and they want it to look natural. So I'll reel this thing. Sometimes I'll reel it slow and then speed it up, and then reel it slow and speed it up. If you have live scope or something like that, you can try and gauge the fish's interest. Other than that, if you don't, just cast it out there and reel it in slowly. It's going to do the work for you. That is the nicest part about this technique. It is the super, super easy way to fish. So now let's go ahead and break down this rod and reel combo here so you can head out on the water and catch fish doing this exact technique. And so when it comes to the rod and reel setup here, I keep it very, very simple. This is just any spinning rod that you have would work. Mostly the longer the better. So I actually have a 7-foot spinning rod that's not this one here. I just had this tied up on here for the time being. I have a 7-foot spinning rod that I fish this on. You could go even longer. It's going to allow you to get a longer cast. Like I said, this bait weighs only 1/8 of an ounce, so it does not cast very far at all. The plastic weighs nothing. It's not like you're adding an 1/8 ounce jig head with a heavier plastic and it's going to cast farther. You pretty much have 1/8 of an ounce and that's it. Then I will have a 2500 size Shimano Sedona on here. That's usually what I like to fish. Great spinning reel for the price. And then I'm going to spool this up with braid. Pretty much all my spinning reels, I spool them up with braid anyway. So this one I have high-vis braid on because I'll use it for other techniques. But the high-vis braid works awesome. To be able to tell if your bait's vibrating, you'll see the actual braid vibrate as well. And then this is 15-pound test. I would highly recommend to use this at the highest end. A lot of times you could put 20 on your spinning reel because it is so thin. And then you tie a leader on anyway, but if you go with 20, you're actually going to lose casting distance because it's a thicker diameter line. So I'll go with 15 or even 10-pound braid, depending on this technique here. If I'm going to use the rod for other stuff, I could put 15 on just to make it more versatile, but if I'm only using it for this technique or other very small finesse techniques, I would go with 10-pound braid. It would work a lot better. You'd get a further cast. And then lastly, I just tie a Fluorocarbon Leader about 10 foot on here. Usually I'll use 8-pound test, but if you want to get some clearer water fish, you're really finessing these fish that are keying in on small bait fish, you could even go down to 6-pound test. It's not really going to make a difference. You're fishing a very light hook. You do not need to set the hook at all. These fish will hook themselves. And then you can just play them very lightly once you get them hooked. So that's the setup there. Basic spinning rod setup with some braid to a fluorocarbon leader, and then you just cast it out there and reel it in, and you'll catch a bunch of fish all fall long. This is an early fall technique when those fish start chasing bait. As the water gets colder and they don't want to push them to the surface anymore, this technique won't become as effective. It'll start to kind of diminish there through the end when you get closer to winter, but to let the fish tell you, they'll be able to tell you when that starts to happen. If you're catching fish, all of a sudden one trip you go out and you start to catch a little bit less and then a little bit less, you know that technique's dying. But when this technique is hot, it's hot and you'll catch a bunch of fish doing it. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and if you did and want to check out some other fall baits, go ahead and check this one out right here. Those ones will be catching you fish all fall long as well. Hit that subscribe button down below and make sure you hit the like button if you enjoyed today's video, and thanks for watching.